August 7, 1942. A volcanic island covered in impenetrable jungle, malaria-infested swamps, heat that could kill a man as surely as a bullet. For 6 months, American and Japanese forces fought for control of Guadalcanal, a speck of land in the Solomon Islands that most Americans had never heard of. It became the bloodiest campaign in Marine Corps history up to that point. More than 7,000 Americans died, killed in combat, drowned at sea, or consumed by tropical disease. But Guadalcanal stopped the Japanese advance across the Pacific. It was the first major Allied offensive of World War II. This is the story of the island that saved the Pacific. By mid-1942, the Empire Japan controlled half the Pacific. In 6 months of stunning victories, they had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and dozens of strategic islands. Their ultimate target, Australia and New Zealand. If Japan could sever the supply lines between America and Australia, the Allied position in the Pacific would collapse. The path to Australia ran through the Solomon Islands, a chain of volcanic rocks northeast of Australia. And in July 1942, American reconnaissance flights discovered something alarming. The Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal. Once operational, that airfield would put Japanese bombers within range of every Allied supply convoy heading to Australia. The Japanese called it a defensive perimeter. The Allies called it an existential threat. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States would go on the offensive. The target, Guadalcanal. The mission, seize that airfield before it became operational. Code name, Operation Watchtower. The Marines had another name for it, Operation Shoestring. The assault force was the 1st Marine Division under Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift. Many of his 16,000 Marines had never seen combat. They were young, most barely out of their teens, children of the Great Depression who joined the Corps to escape poverty. They'd trained at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, then sailed to New Zealand for jungle warfare training. But there wasn't time for proper training. The intelligence was clear. The Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal was nearly complete. If the Allies didn't strike immediately, they'd face Japanese bombers dominating the South Pacific. The Marines loaded onto transports with inadequate maps, unreliable intelligence, and insufficient supplies. They didn't know the terrain. They didn't know the enemy's strength. They had no idea they were about to begin the longest, most brutal campaign in Marine Corps history. Most of these boys had never heard of Guadalcanal. In 6 months, they would never forget it. August 7, 1942, 6:13 a.m. The naval bombardment began, warships pounding the jungle-covered shores of Guadalcanal with 5-inch and 8-inch guns. At 6:50 a.m., carrier-based aircraft screamed overhead, strafing suspected Japanese positions. At 9:10 a.m., the first wave hit the beach. Marines piled out of Higgins boats onto a narrow stretch of sand they called Red Beach. They expected hell. They expected withering machine gun fire, mortars, artillery. Instead, they found almost nothing. The beach was empty. Japanese construction crews, laborers, not soldiers, had fled into the jungle at the first sounds of bombardment. By midday, 11,000 Marines were ashore. By nightfall, they'd advanced inland and captured the unfinished airfield at Lunga Point. Not a single Marine had been killed in the assault. It was almost too easy. The Marines named the airfield Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway 2 months earlier. They didn't know it yet, but Henderson Field would become the most contested piece of real estate in the Pacific. For the next 6 months, both sides would fight, die, and bleed for control of that single muddy airstrip, because whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the skies. And whoever controlled the skies controlled Guadalcanal. The easy landing was a trap. While Marines dug in around Henderson Field, Japanese forces were already responding. On the night of August 8th to 9th, disaster struck. A Japanese naval force, 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer under Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa, steamed down from Rabaul at high speed. Their target, the Allied transport ships unloading supplies off Guadalcanal. At 1:43 a.m. on August 9th, Mikawa's force struck. The Battle of Savo Island lasted less than an hour. It was one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. 4 Allied cruisers were sunk. The USS Astoria, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, and the Australian HMAS Canberra. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died. The Japanese suffered almost no losses. Admiral Mikawa could have annihilated the American transports, stranding the Marines on Guadalcanal without supplies or reinforcements. But fearing American carrier-based aircraft at dawn, he withdrew. It was a tactical victory, but a strategic mistake. The Marines were still there, but they were alone. In the aftermath of Savo Island, the U.S. Navy withdrew. The transports pulled out, taking with them most of the Marines' food, ammunition, medical supplies, and heavy equipment. The Marines ashore watched the ships disappear over the horizon. They had 4 days' worth of food. They had the clothes on their backs and the rifles in their hands. They were stranded on a hostile island, surrounded by enemy forces, with no idea when or if help would arrive. Welcome to Guadalcanal. The first nights were terrifying. Marines dug foxholes along the perimeter of Henderson Field. The jungle pressed them from all sides, a wall of darkness filled with unknown threats. Every rustle of leaves could be an enemy patrol. Every snapping branch could be the prelude to attack. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. The Marines called them Washing Machine Charlie because of the distinctive engine sound, droned overhead nightly, dropping bombs at random. Sleep was impossible. Food was scarce. Within days, the Marines were subsisting on captured Japanese rice, wormy, maggot-infested rice that would be their primary diet for the next 3 months. They had no fresh water supply. They drank from the Lunga River, which ran brown with mud and disease. Dysentery hit within a week. But the worst enemy wasn't bullets or bombs. It was the jungle itself. Guadalcanal wasn't just a battlefield. It was a living nightmare. Temperatures soared to 100 degrees with 90% humidity. Men drenched in sweat within minutes. Uniforms rotted on their bodies. Boots disintegrated in the mud. The jungle was impenetrable. Dense vegetation that blocked out sunlight created claustrophobic tunnels and hid the enemy at 10 yards. Swamps bred disease. Mosquitoes descended in clouds. Malaria struck within weeks. Marines were instructed to take atabrine, a yellow antimalarial drug. But rumors spread that atabrine caused sterility and impotence. Men secretly spit out the pills. By October, malaria was epidemic. Of the 16,000 Marines on Guadalcanal, more than 8,000 contracted malaria. Some men suffered fever dreams so vivid they couldn't distinguish reality from hallucination. Others shook with chills so violent their teeth cracked. Tropical diseases, dengue fever, dysentery, fungal infections, disabled 2/3 of the division. Combat wounded accounted for only 1/3 of casualties. More men were killed by disease than by Japanese bullets. And still they held the line. August 21st, 1942. The first major Japanese ground attack. Colonel Kaineo Ichiki commanded 900 elite troops, veterans of campaigns in China and the Dutch East Indies. Ichiki believed American intelligence reports were wrong. He didn't think 11,000 Marines held Guadalcanal. He thought a few hundred remained. He was catastrophically wrong. At 2 a.m., Ichiki's force charged across the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek, which Marines incorrectly called the Tenaru River. They attacked with bayonets fixed, screaming banzai. They ran straight into Marine defensive positions. Marines with M1 Garand rifles opened fire at point-blank range. Machine guns swept the sandbar. Mortar shells exploded in the surf. The Japanese kept coming. Wave after wave charged into withering fire. None made it across. At dawn, Lieutenant Colonel Al Pollock led a flanking attack. Marines circled behind the Japanese and trapped them against the ocean. Light tanks rolled onto the sandbar, crushing wounded enemy soldiers under their treads. By 9 a.m., it was over. Of 900 Japanese attackers, 800 were dead. Only 15 were captured. The Marines suffered 35 dead and 75 wounded. Colonel Ichiki, humiliated by the disaster, committed seppuku, ritual suicide, on the beach. The Marines buried 800 Japanese bodies in mass graves near the river. The Battle of Tenaru established a grim pattern. Japanese forces would attack with fanatical determination. Marines would slaughter them, but the attacks would keep coming. Every night, the Japanese reinforced. The Tokyo Express, called the Rat Run by the Americans, was a flotilla of fast destroyers that raced down from a bow under covered darkness. They'd arrive off Guadalcanal after midnight, unload troops and supplies, shell Henderson Field, then race back north before dawn, before American aircraft could catch them. The Marines called them the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called it the Rat Transportation. The man who perfected it was Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, one of the most gifted destroyer commanders in history. Night after night, Tanaka's destroyers delivered reinforcements, hundreds of troops, tons of ammunition, artillery pieces, food. The Americans couldn't stop them. Henderson Field's aircraft couldn't fly at night. The U.S. Navy, still reeling from Savo Island, couldn't risk capital ships in the narrow waters around Guadalcanal. So the Japanese reinforced, and the American perimeter remained static. By mid-September, 6,000 Japanese troops were on Guadalcanal. By October, 20,000. The noose was tightening. September 12th to 14th, 1942. The Battle of Edson's Ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson commanded 800 Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion. They held a grassy ridge south of Henderson Field, the last high ground between the Japanese and the airfield. If the ridge fell, Henderson Field fell. And if Henderson Field fell, Guadalcanal was lost. On the night of September 12th, 3,000 Japanese soldiers, nearly 4 times a Marine force, attacked the ridge. They came in human waves, screaming, firing, throwing grenades. The Marines fired until their rifle barrels glowed red-hot. They threw grenades back at the Japanese. They fought hand to hand in the darkness. Edson walked the line, rallying his men. "The only thing they've got that you haven't got is guts," he shouted. The Japanese pushed the Marines back, 100 yards, 200 yards. By dawn on September 13th, Edson's force held a line just 1,000 yards from Henderson Field. One more push would break through. That night, the Japanese attacked again. For 5 hours, they charged the Marine positions. Edson's men were down to their last ammunition. Some Marines fought with entrenching tools and bare hands, but they held. At dawn on September 14th, the Japanese withdrew. They left 600 dead on the ridge. The Marines suffered 135 casualties, but Henderson Field was safe. Edson received the Medal of Honor. His raiders earned a permanent place in Marine Corps legend, and the Japanese learned a terrible lesson. American Marines would not break. Henderson Field was the key to everything. The muddy 3,800-foot runway determined who controlled Guadalcanal. From Henderson, American aircraft could intercept Japanese reinforcement runs. They could bomb enemy positions. They could provide close air support for Marine ground troops. The pilots who flew from Henderson called themselves the Cactus Air Force. Cactus was the Allied code name for Guadalcanal. They flew a hodgepodge of aircraft: Marine F-4F Wildcats, Navy SPD Dauntless dive bombers, Army Air Force P-400 Airacobras, even a few P-38 Lightnings. Most of the planes were damaged, patched together from salvaged parts. Fuel was rationed. Spare parts were non-existent. Mechanics worked 20-hour shifts, keeping planes flying. But the Cactus Air Force was deadly. In the first 5 weeks, they shot down more than 150 Japanese aircraft. Marine Captain Joe Foss alone shot down 26 enemy planes over Guadalcanal, earning the Medal of Honor and becoming the first American ace to match Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. Navy Lieutenant Stanley Swede Vegetasa shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single day, November 11, 1942. The Japanese bombed Henderson Field daily. They shelled it nightly. But every morning, the Cactus Air Force flew. Mud-covered, exhausted, half-starved pilots climbed into patched aircraft and defended the island. Without the Cactus Air Force, Guadalcanal would have fallen in a week. For the men on Guadalcanal, existence was measured in misery. They ate 2 tablespoons of rice per day. Japanese rice captured in the first days, now infested with maggots and worms. They ate it anyway. Hunger was constant. Men lost 30, 40, even 50 pounds. Their uniforms hung on skeletal frames. Malaria came in waves. First the chills, violent shaking that wouldn't stop. Then fever, hallucinations, delirium. temperatures soaring to 105 degrees. Then collapse. Navy corpsmen did what they could with almost no medical supplies. Quinine ran out in September. Plasma ran out in October. Wounded men died from infections that penicillin could have cured, but there was no penicillin. Men lived in foxholes filled with 6 inches of water. Coral cuts became infected and turned gangrenous. Tropical ulcers ate through flesh to the bone. Fungal infections covered skin. And every night, the shelling. Japanese destroyers, cruisers, even battleships bombarded Henderson Field. Men huddled in shelters, ears bleeding from concussion, teeth rattling from blast waves. Some broke mentally, 1,000-yard stares, uncontrollable shaking, catatonia. But most held on. They held on because their buddies depended on them. They held on because Marines don't quit. And they held on because there was nowhere else to go. October 1942, the decisive month. By early October, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal numbered 20,000 troops, including elements of the elite Sendai Division. The Americans, reinforced by Army units, fielded about 23,000 men. Both sides were exhausted, diseased, and hungry, but both sides knew October would decide the campaign. The Japanese plan was simple: overwhelm Henderson Field with coordinated ground, sea, and air attacks. If Henderson fell, Guadalcanal would fall, and the Tokyo Express would deliver 7,000 more troops to finish the job. The American plan was simpler: hold Henderson Field at all costs. What followed was 2 weeks of nonstop combat on land, sea, and air. Multiple battles raged simultaneously. The outcome would determine the course of the Pacific War. October 23rd to 26th, 1942. The Japanese launched their all-out assault. General Harakichi Hayakatake personally led the attack. 2 regiments totaling 7,000 men. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, trying to find weak points in the Marine perimeter. The heaviest fighting occurred at a sector held by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty, Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Puller commanded just 850 Marines. On the night of October 24th, 3,000 Japanese soldiers attacked his position. They came in human waves. Hundreds of men charging through the jungle in the darkness. The Marines opened fire. Machine guns raked the advancing enemy. Artillery fired point-blank into mass formations. Puller walked the line under fire, shouting encouragement. Hold what you've got. They can't get through. The Japanese kept coming. They overran forward positions. Marines fought hand-to-hand with bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, the same John Basilone who'd fought at Tenaru, manned a machine gun section. When his guns ran low on ammunition, he sprinted through enemy fire to bring up more. He single-handedly held a critical position for hours, killing at least 38 Japanese soldiers. For his actions, Basilone received the Medal of Honor, the first enlisted Marine in World War II to earn it. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese attack had stalled. They tried again that night, and again the Marines held. By October 26th, the Japanese assault was broken. They'd suffered 3,500 casualties, half their attacking force, killed or wounded. Marine casualties were 100 dead, 200 wounded. The perimeter held. Henderson Field was safe. For now. While Marines fought on land, the Navy fought at sea. October 11th to 12th, the Battle of Cape Esperance. Rear Admiral Norman Scott commanded a force of cruisers and destroyers. His mission: intercept the Japanese reinforcement convoy. Just before midnight, Scott's force stumbled into Japanese cruisers and destroyers off the northwest coast of Guadalcanal. The Americans had the advantage of surprise. They crossed the T, a naval maneuver where ships cross perpendicular to the enemy, allowing all guns to fire while the enemy can only return fire from forward turrets. For 40 minutes, the two forces blasted each other at close range. The Japanese lost the heavy cruiser Furitaka and the destroyer Fubuki. The Americans lost the destroyer USS Duncan. Scott withdrew at dawn, but he'd accomplished his mission. The Japanese reinforcement convoy turned back. It was the first clear American naval victory since the war began, but it came at a cost. Cape Esperance gave American commanders overconfidence. They believed night fighting favored the Americans. They were wrong. October 13th to 14th, 1942, the worst night of the entire campaign. At 1:33 a.m., two Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, steamed into the waters off Guadalcanal. They carried 14-inch guns, the largest naval rifles in the Pacific. For the next 83 minutes, they systematically destroyed Henderson Field. They fired 970 shells, each shell weighing as much as a Volkswagen Beetle. The bombardment was apocalyptic. 2-ton projectiles smashed into the airfield, creating craters 30 feet deep. Explosions shook the earth like earthquakes. Concussion waves sucked air from lungs. Men's eardrums burst from the pressure. Trees were ripped from the ground. Dugouts collapsed, burying men alive. Aircraft were blown apart. Fuel dumps exploded. The coral runway was pulverized. Marines who survived compared it to the end of the world. Some emerged from shelters unable to hear. Others couldn't stop shaking. Veterans of Edson's Ridge and Bloody Ridge, men who'd faced human wave attacks in hand-to-hand combat, said the battleship bombardment was the most terrifying experience of their lives. At dawn, Henderson Field looked like the surface of the moon. Of 90 aircraft on the field before the bombardment, only 42 were flyable after. But incredibly, casualties were light, about 40 men killed or wounded. The Japanese had targeted the airfield, not the troop positions. And incredibly, by noon that same day, American mechanics had patched the runway enough for planes to take off. Henderson Field refused to die. November 12th to 15th, 1942, the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, the climax of the campaign. The Japanese assembled their most powerful force yet. 2 battleships, multiple cruisers, dozens of destroyers, and transports carrying 7,000 reinforcements. The plan: annihilate Henderson Field once and for all, land overwhelming reinforcements, and crush the Marine perimeter. Standing in their way, a hastily assembled American force under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. Callahan had 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, no battleships, no carriers. On paper, the Japanese had overwhelming superiority. But Callahan had one advantage: desperation. Just after midnight on November 13th, the two forces collided north of Savo Island. What followed was the most vicious naval battle in U.S. Navy history. Ships fought at ranges measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. Capital ships blasted each other point blank. The USS San Francisco and the Japanese battleship Hai traded salvos at less than 2,000 yards. Destroyer USS Laffey charged straight at battleship Hai, firing every gun before being blown apart at 20 feet. The melee lasted 24 minutes. When it ended, the waters off Guadalcanal were filled with burning, sinking ships. The Americans lost 2 cruisers, USS Atlanta and USS Juneau, and 4 destroyers. 1,400 sailors died. Among the dead, Admiral Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only 2 U.S. flag officers killed in surface combat in the entire war. But the Japanese withdrew. The battleship Hai, crippled by dozens of shell hits, limped away, only to be sunk by aircraft from Henderson Field the next morning. The Japanese reinforcement convoy turned back. Henderson Field survived. The battle raged for 2 more nights. November 14th, Japanese cruisers shelled Henderson again. American aircraft counterattacked all day, sinking 7 Japanese transports. November 14th to 15th night, the battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota engaged Japanese battleship Kirishima. Washington's 16-inch guns destroyed Kirishima at 8,400 yards. The Japanese lost a second battleship, more cruisers, dozens of transports. The naval battle of Guadalcanal cost both sides dearly, but it broke the back of the Japanese offensive. They would never again threaten Henderson Field from the sea. By December 1942, the tide had turned. Reinforcements arrived, first the U.S. 164th Infantry Regiment, then the entire 25th Infantry Division, the Americall Division. By January 1943, over 50,000 American troops held Guadalcanal. The exhausted 1st Marine Division, reduced from 16,000 to fewer than 8,000 effective troops, was finally withdrawn. They'd held Guadalcanal for 4 months. They'd fought 6 major battles. 2/3 were sick with malaria or dysentery. The survivors looked like walking skeletons, emaciated, hollow-eyed, aged beyond their years. They boarded transports and sailed for Australia. Many would never fully recover, but they'd done their job. Henderson Field was secure. And now, the Americans went on the offensive. January 1943. For the first time, American forces outnumbered the Japanese on Guadalcanal. U.S. commanders launched coordinated offensives to eliminate remaining Japanese positions. The 2nd Marine Division, fresh and at full strength, pushed west along the coast. Army units drove inland through the jungle. Japanese forces, starved and diseased, fought desperate rearguard actions. But they were beaten. Emperor Hirohito himself authorized withdrawal, the first time Japanese forces would voluntarily retreat in the Pacific War. In Tokyo, they called it strategic redeployment. On Guadalcanal, it was a rout. Between February 1st and February 9th, Japanese destroyers evacuated 10,652 survivors, less than half the force that had landed. They left behind 25,000 dead. Many died not from combat, but from starvation and disease. On February 8th, 1943, American patrols reached the western tip of Guadalcanal. They found abandoned equipment, shallow graves, and silence. The Japanese were gone. On February 9th, General Alexander Patch, commander of Army forces on Guadalcanal, sent a message to Admiral William Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer as terminus on Guadalcanal. The island was secure. 6 months. August 1942 to February 1943. The cost was staggering. For the United States, 1,600 Marines and soldiers killed in ground combat. 4,911 sailors killed in naval battles. 420 airmen killed in aerial combat. More than 4,000 wounded. And thousands more dead or disabled from malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and other tropical diseases. By war's end, more men would die from malaria contracted on Guadalcanal than from enemy action. For Japan, the losses were catastrophic. 24,000 soldiers killed, most from disease and starvation. 3,800 sailors killed in naval battles. Over 1,000 aircraft destroyed. 2 battleships, for cruisers, 1 light carrier, 11 destroyers, and 6 submarines sunk. The Japanese Navy would never recover, but the true cost extended beyond Guadalcanal. The waters around the island, Savo Sound, the channel between Guadalcanal and Florida Island, earned a new name, Ironbottom Sound. So many ships from both sides were sunk there that the seafloor is littered with wrecks. Over 50 warships rest on the bottom. Thousands of sailors entombed in their vessels. Ironbottom Sound remains their graveyard. Guadalcanal changed everything. It was the first major Allied offensive victory in the Pacific. It stopped Japanese expansion cold. Before Guadalcanal, Japan had conquered territory at will. After Guadalcanal, they would fight only defensive battles, losing ground, losing ships, losing men. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese commanders had believed their troops were invincible, that fanatical spirit would overcome material superiority. Guadalcanal proved them wrong. American forces, though outnumbered and undersupplied for months, had prevailed through determination, improvisation, and sheer grit. The strategic impact was decisive. With Guadalcanal secure, the Allies controlled the southern approaches to Rabaul, Japan's fortress in the southwest Pacific. The road to the Philippines, and ultimately Japan itself, was open. General Douglas MacArthur's campaign to retake the Philippines depended on Guadalcanal. Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific depended on Guadalcanal. The invasion of Okinawa, the bombing of Japan, the final victory, all of it traced back to 6 months of hell on a jungle island no one had heard of. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, understood. After Guadalcanal, he told subordinates, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant." He was right. For the men who fought on Guadalcanal, the island never left them. Veterans spoke of nightmares decades later. The screaming charges, the shelling, the faces of friends who never came home. Many suffer from what we now call PTSD, then called shell shock or combat fatigue. They suffered from malaria relapses for the rest of their lives. Some bore physical scars, amputations, disfiguring wounds, tropical diseases that ravaged their bodies. But they also bore pride. They had been tested in ways few humans ever are. They had endured conditions that should have broken them, and they had won. John Basilone, the hero of Bloody Ridge, could have stayed stateside selling war bonds. Instead, he insisted on returning to combat. He died on Iwo Jima in February 1945, leading his Marines inland from the beach. Chesty Puller went on to become the most decorated Marine in Corps history. 5 Navy Crosses, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, 2 Legions of Merit, and countless other awards. Joe Foss, the Marine ace, became governor of South Dakota and first president of the American Football League. The veterans of Guadalcanal became the backbone of the Corps. They trained the next generation. They taught the lessons paid for in blood, adaptation, improvisation, never quit, and they never forgot the island, or the men who stayed there forever. Today, Ironbottom Sound is a war grave. Divers descend to find ships exactly where they sank 80 years ago. The USS Quincy, her guns still trained toward the enemy. The USS Juneau, which carried the 5 Sullivan brothers, all killed when the ship was torpedoed. Japanese cruisers and destroyers, entombed crews still at their stations. By international agreement, the wrecks are protected. They are not to be disturbed. They are monuments to the men who fought there. Above the water, Guadalcanal is peaceful now. The jungle has reclaimed the battlefields. Henderson Field is now Honiara International Airport. The defensive perimeters are overgrown. The foxholes are filled in, but memorials remain. The U.S. maintains a war cemetery. The Guadalcanal American Memorial stands on a ridge overlooking Henderson Field, exactly where the Marines fought in October 1942. Plaques list the names of the dead, Marines and soldiers, sailors and airmen, men who died at 19, 20, 21 years old. They gave their lives for an island most Americans still can't find on a map, but the veterans know, and they remember. Guadalcanal was the first step on the road to Tokyo. Every island that followed, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, build on lessons learned in the jungle. Amphibious assaults, combined operations, close air support, jungle warfare, all refined on Guadalcanal. The Navy learned night fighting. The Marines learned to hold against overwhelming odds. The Army learned to fight in the Pacific. And the United States learned that victory was possible. From Guadalcanal in August 1942 to Tokyo Bay in September 1945. 3 years of brutal warfare. Every step of that journey began on an 8 by 25-mile island covered in jungle and soaked in blood. Guadalcanal, 6 months of jungle warfare. The island that saved the Pacific. 7,000 Americans gave their lives. 24,000 Japanese soldiers died. Thousands of sailors rest at the bottom of Ironbottom Sound. We will never forget them. We will never forget what they won for us. Thank you for watching this documentary. If you found this documentary meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share.